you'll hear the awesome person that's like, hey, this is recorded. And then I'm gonna start a screen share. Before I do that, how's everyone like doing? Any feedback, comments?
Getting used to it so far. It's not too bad. I like it.
That's good. I will accept not too bad. Thank you.
Definitely something to just like mentally prepare for. It's like the working, consistent working, and being tempted to go outside and stay outside, but having to come back here and work more.
Yeah. Has anyone like been constantly going outside, like getting sunshine?
Yeah.
Cool. That's good. I was definitely like Amelie last week where I was like, I haven't gone outside in 4 days
Oh
because I
no.
was just like on my computer the whole time. And then after computer, I had dinner and went to sleep. And then I think I went to Olympia over the weekend and I was just like, what is the outside world? And then there was that thunderstorm and I was like, oh my God. Yeah, it was crazy. Crazy times.
Right?
Sweet. I don't hear any other feedback. Cool. So I started recording. I'm gonna share my screen. You should be able to see my screen. Cool. Something I want to say about these lectures is I have a preset plan that I prep for. However, it's always flexible based on you all and the students itself. Every cohort has a different learning style, and every cohort likes implementing new things into the lectures itself. And starting probably like next week or late this week, I'll start releasing like daily feedback surveys. So it'll just be like a Google form that's routine, released at the end of the day. And it'll just be some questions that you can answer either regarding lecture, structured throughout the day. And we'll actually implement that if we can. We can't get to everybody. But if it's something that's possible, then we'll definitely do it. So don't be like shy or don't be scared to share feedback with us. We always use it to improve our lectures and also make sure that we're kind of catering to you because we want to support you the best way we can. Cool. Now my computer is dying, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Or not sharing my screen, sharing my video because it's like too much for Zoom to handle. But I'm still here. So don't feel like I'm not here. I'm just going to be turning my video off. Anytime I record, it always kind of freaks out. Cool. And let's go ahead and get started and kind of like transition into taking a look at hashketball. I have this file here that's just hashketball.rb. And then I have our spec file, which you're probably familiar with seeing in the hashketball class. I do have a solution that I wrote for it before this one, or when I did prep. Our goal in the specific lecture is not to get through every single method and build it out. It's to build that curiosity of how do I debug a problem that I'm seeing for the first time? What can I do to improve my skill sets? And this also kind of uses like enumerables and things like that to go through and find the values that I want. So this is here for reference. I upload all of my lecture code right after, so you can take a look through and like compare it with what you did. However, like this is just one way to do it. It's not the best way. Cool. And I ask a lot of questions during lecture itself. I typically like to have a new person kind of like answer each time, so try to mix it up. I don't want to have one student answering a question all the time. Be mindful of that and be mindful of each other as you collaborate to figure out a solution together. And I'll pause at some points to kind of give you some time to think about the answer before we kind of move forward. Sweet. Let me open up Swabouts. Render this. Shift V. Cool. So I have this like markdown file that I have a template of already. And just some notes on what we're going to go through. Dang it. I always like to ask, does anyone know what this stands for? But I always forget to remove this, so it's fine. So BATS in our context stands for students will be able to. And the goal is by the end of this lesson or lecture, you should be able to have some idea of how to do these bullet points. And if we don't get to all of them, we'll kind of cover it in the next lecture itself. They kind of blend into each other. But if you're ever like reviewing lecture or you're going through your GitHub repositories and you're like, which one was the one where they taught us how to use pry, or which one was the one they taught us single responsibility principle, you can kind of just do like a query search. It'll pull up the README and the repository. So that's one way you can use this. You can also just use this as a guideline when you're doing review, concepts that you should be able to understand for the specific lecture itself or at this point in time. Cool. And then some like tips that you'll get more comfortable with as we work through more of this. Otherwise, I'm just gonna like dive right in. What I wanted to start out with is to kind of like maybe get a summary of how you all feel about hashketball, the infamous lab. Were there any parts where you liked hashketball? Like, what are some things that are positive that's jumping up in your memory, if any at all, maybe? Things that you liked about the hashketball lab.
I think that after the pigeon lab, it was nice because I got like a flow while I was doing it, you know? Does that make sense?
Yeah. The pigeon lab. I'm trying to remember that one. I have to re-jog my memory. Cool. So nice break after working on like previous labs. Any other positives from hashketball you remember?
I liked building hashketball just because you knew what you were putting in there and you knew what each part of the code meant because you built it.
Yeah. True, because you build up the hash yourself, right? And then you get to build the methods that go off of that hash to get the data.
I like that it forced. Sorry, I like that it forced you to kind of look things up. You know what I mean? Like look up different methods and stuff like that to force you to Google search and stuff and do that things on your own. Things you're gonna have to do. You know, so.
Sometimes I turn my brain off and just type everything you say. So if I put something that doesn't make sense, forgive me. Cool, thank you. Yeah. Getting more comfortable with researching, looking things up.
And I also liked that it was a little bit more complex and it had a lot of layers to it.
You saying that just reminded me what Pigeon Lab was with the nested hashes and you have to flip the key values. Oh my gosh, yes. Cool, so working with like nested data types, hashes, definitely makes things more complicated. I think I had to record the video for that where I was like, okay, emoticon is next on my list. I'll eventually get to that one. Cool. All right, final additions to the list.
I like that the nested hash was was on the page, so it was easier to look back and forth as opposed to have to hop between files, kind of. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think I see what you're.
It was a lot less hopping around from tab to tab.
Yeah.
It's just all right there in front of you.
Cool. It's definitely useful, like having everything in the file itself. All right, got some good things going for positives. Any negatives? We'll try to get those too. Or maybe you were like, you know, hashketball was great.
I felt like I repeated myself quite a lot doing it, and that was probably more to about my skill level. And I'm sure that if I were to look back at it, I could probably find a more efficient way of doing it. But yeah, I definitely repeated myself a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that my hardest part with it was when I was trying to access the player's symbol or player's key, and I felt like I couldn't because the first key or the first value to one of the keys was a string. So I remember having a big issue there. But once I got that, I felt like everything else, like I said, kind of just.
Yeah. I also just realized I'm not sharing my screen. I think this is going to be a constant issue that I will face in life. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Because you can't see anything I'm typing. I'm just typing into.
We can see
what
it.
you're typing.
Oh, wait, you can? I am sharing? Never
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah, 100% sharing your
I
screen.
take that back. Never mind. I am fine. All right. Continue. Any other cons? Cool. So I think, oh wait, let me hit share one more time. Because I think, so y'all can still see my screen, right? So these are great things to bring up. The first code that you write, I admit, is not always going to be the most efficient or the most refactored code, and that is totally fine. In the beginning, our focus is going to be getting the solution to work, and then you can think about refactoring. And there's actually a principle that we'll practice to handle like repeating yourself and making your code more efficient. This principle will say dry. Does anyone know what dry stands for?
Don't repeat yourself.
Yeah, don't repeat yourself. This is don't repeat yourself. And that goes hand in hand with the first point. So anytime when I say like dry up your code or think about keeping your code dry, that's what I mean. How can you take duplicate code that you're writing and reorganize it so that you can create helper methods, you can write specific loops to make it more efficient. So we'll actually get practice with that today. And then refactoring will always be something that you want to do throughout your life here as a coder. The coolest part is going back and looking at code you wrote like a month ago, and you're just like, what did I do? Who was I? And then you get to kind of see how much you've grown in the code that you write in as a developer. So you'll always be thinking about refactoring and making codes more efficient. And this symbol versus string thing is a Ruby thing that will follow you forever. So at least until mod 2, hashes are not indifferent hashes. There are special types of hashes where you can interchange them. And I'll show you a couple cases of examples of this, but you do have to kind of pay attention to whether the key value is a string or a symbol, because Ruby treats them as different. It doesn't yell at you, it kind of just fails silently and returns nothing, which isn't helpful to us, but you'll get more comfortable with it as you use Ruby and more. This is a cool point to kind of bring up now. Cool. I am happy that there are more positives than cons. Yay! So hashketball on a good note. With this, we're going to transition into our implementation of hashketball and just kind of get through as many methods as we can. On a note for kind of like practicing, this time I didn't upload any code pre-lecture. Sometimes I will upload the code repository so you can kind of pull it down and you can code along if you want to. I don't always recommend it because there will be a time where you make a typo or you miss something and then you spend an extra 5 minutes trying to fix it. And then by the time that you fix it, we're like super far in lecture and you're wondering what happened. So even though I don't always recommend like coding along or anything like that, there will be times where, especially given the Zoom environment, I think it's super helpful if you have some kind of like, if you have VS Code open and you can just code along, or there will be times where I give you a couple minutes to code up your own version and then we'll go through it together. So still have VS Code open so you can write some sort of code, even though it's not going to be like integrated in here. It will be interactive somewhat, at least for today. I'll have you write a couple methods out and then we'll review it. So have it open, but don't code along 100%. And if you're like, I want to code along for sure, if you get lost, just start following along with lecture and we'll upload the code so you'll have access to it after. Sweet. Any questions on that? All right. For our world right now, I'm going to be kind of practicing test-driven development, and we'll be using that as a guide to find our solutions here. So there's a couple different ways that you can start writing code for your project or for your labs. You can kind of just start like blindly writing up methods based on the RSpec test, and then like write code, test it out, hope it works, and go back and forth. You can use those tests to lead you as a guide. So every single lab that's provided for you, as you might be familiar with, has a RSpec file attached to it. And spec, or RSpec, just stands for Ruby specifications. It's the testing environment that we use to run against Ruby code that you write and make sure that the code you write is bug-free. Of course, like, this is not going to be 100%. So we don't test for like every single edge case, but we test for enough to make sure that your code is working. So there will be times where even RSpec, you'll write the correct solution and it'll be like, or you'll write the wrong solution and it'll say, yeah, this is good, great. And you'll be like, what? This doesn't make sense. So it's totally normal. In the world of testing, it's hard to get like 100% of the edge cases covered. But we do use this environment to kind of just like run labs and test your code all the time. So it's a good thing to get familiar with. Every single method that you have to write will have its own task described for it. And you can actually go in and see like what the value is, what method is it passed into, and what is the method expected to return. So those are probably like the 3 components that you need to pay attention to when you are looking at these methods. And if at any point during lecture today, you don't understand what I said, or you want to ask a question, feel free to interrupt me. I totally welcome it, all the questions, and then I'll pause and kind of like answer it and then continue forward. So feel free to like chime in anytime. We'll be using these tests as a guide to write our methods today. So kind of write the first one out with a combination of asking questions, and then we'll see how far we get. Cool. And I'm like, sure, I'll use the console in here to debug things out. If you want to launch the terminal, I know some of you have VS Code installed, or the terminal installed for VS Code. It's the control key plus the tilde key. So I'll kind of like tell you shortcuts as I use it. But if you're like, you want the shortcut for just opening and closing a terminal, that's what it is. Cool. And then I'm in my hashketball repository. And what is the command that I can use to run my, let's say I want to run my first test and see what it should return. What's the command that I can use to run that?
Fast fail.
And how do I run fast fail?
I was doing learn dash dash fail dash fast.
Sometimes I type too fast. I'm like, no. Need to wait for the student. So this specific one, I don't have learn set up, which is totally fine. But your command is completely correct. For this one, since it's not attached to like a learn gem, I can also say RSpec and it'll do the same thing. Learn is actually running RSpec in the backend. It's running RSpec commands, or it's looking for the spec file anyway, so it's doing the same thing. But since learn is a whole gem, it kind of like implements all that in the background. Cool. Thank you. All right. And then granted, if we just used this as a guide to lead us into our solution, this can kind of look like weird and daunting in the beginning. But fail fast is super cool because you can kind of just go a test at a time. Rather, if you just run learn, it's going to give you like everything. But taking a look at this, if we read through, this is our first task. Num point scored knows the number of points scored by each player. Cool. And then there's like the specific test case it's running. And then this is our actual error. So all of our errors will be in red. And anytime you see this, it means it's directly failing. It's not even able to apply any tests. So take some time to read through this error. And when someone is ready, what's the reason that we're failing right now? This test.
We didn't create a method first.
Yeah, I didn't create a method first. And if I wanted to fix this, what are my solutions steps?
We put def num points scored and then end.
Cool. Ooh, also, I'll post all my VS Code extensions. That will be like super helpful down the road. But there's an extension called endwise. It only has one purpose: to put an end after your loops and method. It's great. I forget my ends all the time. So if you're like, I want this extension, I'll link it into the Slack channel. Cool. Making our way through. And then we're like, cool, none points scored, got a different error. I always welcome all the errors that you see in the Ruby world. When you get a different error, it's a good sign. It means you passed the other one and you moved on to the next one, so you're making progress. So now we got the method defined. However, I'm still failing to run my test through it. And can someone else tell me what this means? Still in the same method.
It looks like it's missing an argument. So you probably have to give it the argument hashketball.
Argument hashketball.
Yeah. Or
you can give this any argument that, oh my God, I can't spell. Yeah. Hashketball, cool. No. Hashketball, one word? Is that one word? Sure. Not starting to look like a word to me. Sweet. So given 1, expected 0. And seeing this, it might feel like a little bit flipped because you're like, well, it's saying like given 1, you might expect it to be like flipped, maybe like given 0, but I actually expect 1 argument for this test case. But what you want to keep in mind is when this test runs, it's running against your code. So your code is the single source of truth. So it's actually saying, hey, the code that I'm testing against said that I shouldn't be getting any arguments, but my test case is giving 1. So that's something to be keeping in mind when you see this error. It might feel a little flipped, but that's exactly right. We're expecting an argument. You might have to reevaluate this hashketball variable because we'll kind of see what is actually being passed in. Now, next person. We made some progress, expected 10, got nil. What's like the fastest way I can fix this to get this error to pass?
Just type in 10.
Just type in 10. Awesome. I accept. And now we're like, cool. We actually passed the first step, which is awesome, but now we're passing the second one. So this is where we can be more intentional about the values that we return. 10 works for the first case, but for the second case, it's going to fail because there's more to passing in this variable and getting the value that we want. Now, bunch of different ways to debug this. Figure out which works best for you. You can look at the spec file and actually look at that specific, this specific test case. Oops, too fast. And map it up. Like Jeff Adrian equals 10, Bismack Biombo equals 12. Take a look at your hash and figure out what it needs to go there. What I'm actually going to do for us today is use binding.pry. We need to get comfortable with using binding.pry within our program so we can debug our applications really well and get into the habit of kind of like not being afraid of putting as many pries as we need to inside of our program to debug it. In the real world, when you start working, there's never really going to be a time where you're going to know the values or the data that's coming in through your program or your application. One, you're going to be working with code that's already been provided for you. Similar to this, even though this is like a very small data set, where you have data that's been provided that you need to work with to come up with the solution that you want to. And two, you're never going to really know what this data is. We have the luxury of taking a look at these test files and finding the corresponding values that you want. That's not always going to be the case. So we need to get comfortable with using pry or using a debugger. Every single project that you work on is going to come with its own debugging tool or debugger tool. For Ruby, it's rspec and binding.pry. So I'm going to put a binding.pry here. And to use binding.pry, I just insert these keywords where I want to implement this. And then you also have to require pry into your code so that your Ruby program knows which source code to use to implement pry. Any questions on this? All right. And can someone tell me like what binding.pry does, if you're comfortable?
It kind of opens up the code at that runtime and then allows you to access any of the variables or any of the things that you have working in that instance.
Yeah. working? I think that's what you said. Cool, thank you. That's exactly right. I love the opens up the code part because it's kind of like opening up or prying into the code during runtime. That's the important part. This is happening. Let me put this here. During runtime. So Ruby is literally taking your code, going line by line by line, implementing every single thing we have here. And if we take a look, there's only one thing that we have access to at this moment in time. We have this method called gameHash that we define. And Ruby has implicit return as a reminder. So the only purpose of this method is to return this hash that we've created. So Ruby goes through, runs everything, line by line by line. It reaches 127 at some point, and it's going to pause it. So anything that potentially can be run after hasn't been run yet. That's the important thing to keep in mind. Anything after this, so if I say like var equals 10, var is a bad variable name, num equals 10, and maybe like num2 equals 5, I don't have access to this because my pry during runtime put the stop point here. So that's the important thing that you need to know about pry. You have any access to everything up until that time that's been run, and everything's been paused right after. So if I wanted to kind of like put a pause point here, and the main thing I want to point out here is you can definitely like guess and like assume what this data set is because you created it, you have access to it. I want us to get into a habit of not assuming we know what we're going to expect and not guessing. Put a pry there and just see what that value is. It takes away a lot of the guesswork. It takes away, and it eases up your debugging process. So let's go ahead and I'm going to run fail fast again. And RSpec, if we take a look, has its own set of tests that it's running. So this is where we're at. It's running through every single line of this because it's making this method call on line 29. And this method call leads to the runtime of this method, which leads to our pry. So if we're kind of doing like a trace back of this flow that's happening on our program right now, that's what's going on. And we can see on line 127, there's this pry. And if I type in like num, I get nil, just as like an example. Hasn't been run yet. Same thing with num2. But I have access to everything before this, which is gameHash. So if I type in gameHash, if I can spell, gameHash, cool. I have all of this stuff, which is awesome because this also takes away the guesswork. This is my gameHash. I need to somehow find the value that I want for this method in here. And because I've implemented pry in the middle, I also have access to the variables that were passed in the signature, which is hashketball. And let's take a look at what hashketball is. Hashketball is Jeff Adrian, which is exactly what we would expect to see based on the spec and based on the value here. Cool. Now taking a look at this value that's being passed in, what would be a name we can rename this to rather than hashketball?
Player name?
Yeah, player name. Thank you. So always try to name your variables based on what the value is going to be, just to help you a little bit. And just like we did, we totally were like, let's just put in hashketball for now. Let's just put in X for now, put a binding.pry to debug and go from there. Totally fine. Start with some working code so that you can kind of build off of that and get to where you need to go. And mouse is freaking out. Cool. All right, so we got Jeff Adrian. We have this gameHash, and what we need to do is return these points. And like some of you were saying earlier, this is one of the cases where we have to kind of like look at this complex data set. We have nested hashes, we have arrays nested inside of this hash, and we kind of have to work our way through and figure out, all right, how can I take this and compare it with this and return it? And even if we take a look at this hash set here, we have two different data points that are available. We have this away element and we have this home element. And if we, for example, if we're like, well, what are all the keys that are available to me? It's say hashketball anymore. I should rerun this, but it's okay. I can say game hash.keys, which gives me away and home. And if I say game hash.values, it gives me access to the 2 values for those keys, which is the team name and color and players. Cool. So that kind of gives us a starting point on things that we can iterate through. Now, which of these are going to give me, which has the value that I want? Keys or values?
Values.
Values. So I need to somehow iterate through these values to figure out what I want. So let me go ahead. I guess I could do it here. So I got game hash dot values and somehow go through this and pull out what I need. So I'm going to create this variable called, not called players, values equals game hash dot values. And from here, I need a way to get access to these elements. So any thoughts on what my next steps could be? I feel like space is a commodity right now. Got my method at the top.
Are you asking us how we need to get through the hashes?
Yes, in a sense. So what would be my next step? So that what I want is the points, and I have access to Jeff Adrian. So what can I do from here? We said that game hash.values has the data that we need to compare with. So what's kind of like a reasonable next step that I can do from here?
Just do an iteration, I'm guessing.
And do an iteration through this whole thing?
Yes.
All right. What iterator would you like to use?
I don't want to say dot each, but I feel like that's the one I'm only thinking about right now.
That's fine. Dot each is cool. Cool. So we're gonna do dot each and then do some kind of iteration through. I'm gonna say value here and then do end. And this is more just like getting to the habit of taking everything step by step and writing up an algorithm for it. So we're at a point where we're like, I need to iterate through each. And this is my value. So it's going to be each value that I see inside of here. And if even before we even write code, at this point in time, just in plain English, what are we trying to do?
Find the number of points scored based off the player's name.
So find the number points scored, and it's going to be based off the player's name. Cool. So this is what we want, and this is what we've been given. Awesome. So have a clear idea of the data that you have available and the data that you're trying to return. So that's something to keep in mind with this each loop. The value that I'm actually going to be returning is just an integer. That's going to be returned from this method. So we don't really need access to any of this other stuff. We just need the integer. And then something like weird that we can do with pry, not weird. You can put a pry anywhere you want within your program. So you can actually put a pry in between the loop, which you'll see me do all the time. So notice how it's going through the values hash, and we have a pry inside of here. So before it even hits this pry, because we have the loop before, it hit all of those values. And the only thing that I really want to take a look at here is this value that I'm passing in. Because if I type in value inside of this pry, it's going to give me the first iteration that you're going through, which is going to be the first value inside of our key. So this is all of our home players, since that is our, or away players, since that's the first data point we have access to. And that goes back to the initial question. I'm iterating through this. What can I type in to get access to this variable?
the team, or never mind, the team information hash, like the one up above. I don't know. Never mind.
That's okay. It's good to formulate. And I can give some time. I'll wait like 20 seconds. Take a look at what we have.
Can you do value and then the brackets for player?
So value brackets for players. Cool. So value brackets for players. This is like way but at the bottom. Thank you. Gives us access to this data type here. And what do you notice about the data type of this? Whenever I say data type, I'm asking if it's like a string, integer, float, array.
It's an array.
It's an array of hashes.
It's an array of hashes. So
you just concatenate the points onto that request for players.
Oh, onto this. Like
yeah.
This? So we get this error. This is really good because you'll run into this error a ton in your life in Mod 1. Like, get comfortable seeing this. Any thoughts on why this is happening?
Because it's trying to combine a integer with a string, and so you have to. Is it 2_s? I think because it can't be a string and an integer, right? It has to be just one.
Oh, like 2s, like this?
Yeah. Well,
or
bracket and then is it points and then the bracket and then dot 2s? I can't remember.
Dot.
Well, like after points, you just do the dot.
Oh, like 2s.
Yeah, _s. Yeah. Nope.
Okay, I'm still getting this error. That was good. Good guess.
Value player is a string is an array, so we also need each do to pick each one, then choose the points.
Yeah, so in this case, even before we get to here, I forgot who answered this part. Like, this was an array. So this gives us an indication, like Nicole said, that we need to iterate another further. So like do one more iteration to go through each of those elements. And you can literally, or like, if we take this literally, this error, it's saying no implicit conversion of a symbol, which is anything which is a reference to a different variable, anything with this colon before it, into an integer. Anytime we're saying like bracket integer, like bracket 0, bracket 1, bracket 2, this is how array indexing works, because anytime you need to access an element inside of an array, you use an index. So that's what Ruby is trying to do. It's taking your symbol and it's trying to reference it as 2, 3, 4, because this is an array. And we just need to iterate through this. So if I say points 2, I say this, which is technically works, because this is going to the second element inside of this array, which is Bismack Biombo, which is 3, oh right, 0, 1, 2, which is 3, gives us about points of 24. Array indexes always start at 0, so we would need to do that. But we got an integer back, which is num point scored. Now it's trying to figure out how can you abstract this to be put into here. So we know this works. And then someone mentioned we need to iterate through this to go over this part. So we can say each do. It's very, very nested right now, but it's okay. And then I'm going to say player. I'm intentionally excessively putting binding.pry everywhere. You do not have to do this. If you need to exit nested pries, you can put 3 exclamation points and it'll completely exit pry. As your friend. All right, and then follow the line number. We're on line number 31, which is perfect. So we have access to this player. And just like someone mentioned, we can go into points from here. So we can say player points, and we get 10. Awesome. So I can say player of points. All right. Now, this will just return every single points. Both of these are each, which we'll take a look at in a bit. However, whose points do I actually want to return?
You want to return player name.
Yeah, so we got first part done. We found the number of points scored, but we need to match it with player name. So we can say just like if player name, player of player name equals player name, return player points. Probably need to set that to a variable so we can say like points equals, sure. I'll make it 0 for now. Cool. So we went back and forth with pry and with kind of like debugging from our console to taking a look at our games hash, putting pries where we needed to, but we have some kind of solution here. And the player name is equal to what we want for each individual player. We get access to these. We can return the points. There's like tons of code. Oh wait, let me take out all of these pries and then we'll rerun it. Any questions on what we've done so far? Or why we did what we did? Oh no, I should take this out so it doesn't return those integers. Take 3. Cool. Oh wait. This is a fun one. So we have a solution, but it's saying expected 10, got this. Any thoughts on why this is happening? It's a fun error.
Returning values, the variable, because it's at the end.
Yeah, exactly. And why is values this whole thing? Like, why did we get this hash?
Is it because each doesn't return anything? So it's just giving you game hash dot values?
Yes, exactly. That's why. So that's something important to keep in mind when you use each. Each will always return the original source that you're working with. And in our case, it's returning the values that we were pulling out of from our game hash. So when you use each, be careful, because sometimes you'll get the original value, or you're gonna, even if I didn't put this in a variable, I'd still get this exact same thing because it's the last thing that got implemented. So each returns the original thing no matter what you do inside of it, which is the main lesson here. So I'm gonna add points at the end so that it just returns points. Not the most efficient one, but we'll talk about efficiency like later. The main part is we got a solution to work, we debugged it properly, and we utilized pry, which is something I want us to get comfortable doing.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you had values equal the game hash, or yeah, dot values, dot, dot, dot. Couldn't you have just done it without setting values equal to that and just not having that in general?
That's true. I don't need to set it to a variable here because I'm not using it anywhere. That's right.
But yeah. Why did you set it in the beginning?
I set it, so usually I always recommend putting something in a variable so that you can use it later, rather than doing like chains or nested queries to make debugging a little bit easier. So by habit, you'll see me just put our data points that we're working with into a variable. And I intentionally put it in values in case we did anything later to show that each is going to return the original thing. So values would have been the whole data set rather than the actual, even though like we're setting points, we have an if statement, we have nested queries in here, each is always going to be the original thing that you're going to look at. Yeah, that was a good question. But typically, if you are using each, the only thing you should really create values or variables for is what you're going to return or what you're going to use later on in your program. Okay. Any other questions? And then our num point scored went away, which is good, which means that our first pass or test passed. Cool. And then let's take a look at our second one here, which is now shoe size. And then we're getting our infamous like no method error, which typically means that the method isn't there. And it's telling us which task it is. So I'm gonna go ahead and add shoe size. And then run this again. And then it's expected 1, which is cool. So I can add 1. And notice how this is also player name. So the data set that's being passed in, very similar, except this time we want to get shoe size. So I'm gonna like pause for just a couple seconds. And we're going through a pretty similar process as before. Any thoughts on what the solution for this is gonna look like?
Pretty much the same thing as what we did before.
Yeah, so instead of looking for points, we're looking for shoe size, I think.
Yeah,
that might be, or we're looking for shoe, not shoe size, I think is what it's done for, what it's actually in the array.
Yeah, so it's the
Yeah.
exact same thing, except now we're looking for shoe size. Another keyboard shortcut, if you hit Command D, it'll select all the words that are the same, which is super useful if you want to do like find and replace. In this case, I'm going to replace points with shoe size. This will totally work. However, we want to drive our code. Anytime you copy paste something, it's an indication that it needs to go into a helper method. So you should never have areas inside of your program where you're repeating code a bunch of times. The only difference between this and this is shoe size. So we got to think about how can I extract this logic, abstract it out. So the only thing that's returned to me is maybe like the values of the player equals player name, or at least the values, and I can go ahead and just return shoe size from there. So let's go ahead and like maybe think of a method that could do that. So I can say def maybe like player data. I have no idea. Player takes in player name. So I could pass in the player name to that method, and that'll handle finding the player data. But this one actually just controls num points scored. And this also kind of bleeds into talking about single responsibility principle. So there's a lot of things happening here. One, we're duplicating code, so we're making that inefficient and extracting it into a separate method. And two, this method is doing like 3 different things. It's iterating through game hash, it's iterating through each value, it's finding the matching player, and returning the player's points. And when we talk about single responsibility principle, we're trying to assign only one thing that method can do. And it'll only do that one task and return, feed into or return that only one function, and that's it. It's not going to do anything else. Even this, we can extract it to be a little bit more efficient because it's doing like 3 different things. But at least it's a starting point to extract this logic out. So I can say like, could name this, I'll name this values to be a little bit more clear. So I'm going through game hash dot values. Never mind, I'll keep this values. And I'm taking a look at each value and I'm finding the matching player name, except instead of returning the points, I just want to return player. So here I can say like player equals an empty string maybe. And then I can say player equals player and then return player. And even taking a look at this can feel a little bit like there's 3 different steps that I'm doing just to set one value. And when you're using each, since it's always going to return the original thing, this is what you have to do. You'll have to like have a variable that's keeping track of the data point you want to return, and then you can set that data point. If someone is comfortable with enumerables, any suggestions on different enumerables that I can use? All right. So I want to transition into going or stepping away from getting too comfortable using each for our enumerators. It's a great stopping point or starting point. However, there's different enumerators that we can use inside of Ruby that could make this process much easier. And I recommend, it doesn't really matter if it's like 2.1, if you have 2.6 installed, that's totally fine. I recommend going through this enumerables doc and kind of just reading through all these different enumerables that are available to us and what we can use. We'll kind of go over the most important ones that you probably need to know and get comfortable with, and you'll get more comfortable with this throughout the week, but start looking at this and experimenting with a bunch of different ones. Taking a look at this, is anyone like anything popping out, jogging your memory for enumerables? And then I'll wait for a little bit. And then if not, I can show you.
I feel like I felt more comfortable with the numerals before we used like each for like the pigeon and each for this lab. And then after that, I just feel like it all went out the window.
That is totally okay. Yeah, I think we do release like the order. I'm trying to remember, like pigeon organizer, you have to use each because you don't really have too much freedom on modifying the data structure. So that's understandable. And you'll definitely be able to get more comfortable with them throughout the week. I do recommend getting more practice, so revisit that. Starting out with each is cool, and then make each more efficient. So in this case, if we take a look at these deliverable, we want to be able to filter this array out so that we just get the data where player name equals player name. That's our goal. And then in this case, we don't need to worry about num scored because single responsibility principle says the player should just return the player object. This method is not responsible for figuring out num points scored. So really all I really need to return is this player name equals player name. And with enumerables, what you want to pay attention to is what are the parameters that's passed into the block, and the block is whatever is inside of these pipes. So that's the variable you're enumerating through. And what is the return value that I want? And the return value that I want is all of the variables that equal a specific value. And with Ruby, there's a couple different methods that do the exact same thing, and you have creative freedom on which one you want to use. So find all and select are the exact same thing. There's no difference in implementation between them. So you can pick, if you're like, I like the sound of find all better than select, you can use find all. And I think filter is also the same. So a lot of different like creative freedom on how you want to write it out. But the main point is select iterates through an array. It takes in a Boolean condition. And this is typically known as an expression. So it has to evaluate to true or false. And anytime this condition evaluates to true, it adds it to a new array and returns it. So that's the main thing. If we're taking a look at this pattern here, what is our condition that we're checking against?
If player name equals player name.
Mm-hmm. So if player name equals player name that's passed in, go ahead and return this. If not, completely ignore it. And then this green just indicates what's actually returned. So the important thing to pay attention to is select is always going to return a new array. So it's not mutating the original one. And it's going to return a new array of all the values that evaluated to true. So we can kind of like clean this up a little bit because we don't need, let's see, I think we still need this inner one here. So we can make this a little bit better. But we can change it to select. So just like each, it just replaces it. And it automatically returns a new array. So I don't need this stuff. And I can take out this. Okay, so I'm cleaning things up a little bit. And then I'll remove these comments. So I'm going through game hash values.each. And I'm doing a select off of that. And this is the expression. Player of player name equals player name. And then in here, rather than doing all of this, I now have access to a helper method. Let me actually move this up. So we have access to our outline that we wrote. And all I need to do is take in the player that's returned. Player name. This might feel a little bit weird, but I'm just doing num points. Maybe. Nope, just points. Okay. Points. But I'm just returning points from there. And the cool part is I'm just going to do the exact same thing here. So I get all of that gets replaced with one line, which was shoe size. So even just, and then this is the exact same logic. If we write out the algorithm for this, we're saying find the player that matches player name, return shoe size. So this dried up our code a ton. Now our methods are reduced to one line. It only has, and this kind of shows single responsibility principle. It's only doing one thing. It's calling one method and it's returning shoe size from that result. Any questions on this? Like what we did here?
I have a problem with calling a different method in a new method. Like,
yeah.
I guess just like how? Because like with variables, if it's outside your method, you can't access them. Why and how can you access a different method?
Ooh, gotcha. So like scoping and how is scoping working? So with variables, every single variable that you probably created so far are local variables. The only time you can use it is within the method, exactly like you said. Methods or functions, these are source code that you write that's available throughout this whole file, because these are methods that you created on your own. And Ruby is going to load up this whole file and make these methods available to you, which is why we have access to this method game hash. If we made this a variable, we won't have access to it unless we call the method, which is exactly what's happening here. Because we define this game hash method, we have access to this data that we can use throughout here. We're really invoking that method, which is exactly what we're doing here. So similar to how we can use game hash anywhere we want, you can also create helper methods as much as you want and use them anytime, anywhere. So I always recommend defining helper methods, and the rule behind that is anytime you see yourself copy pasting code, that can become an extra method that could be reused everywhere else. So rather than writing code again and again and again, I can make that more efficient by defining a method for it and then use that in multiple method calls. So it makes the debugging process much easier. It makes your code more efficient. And now this is something that's available to you. Like this method, I don't only have to use it for finding a player data. I can use it for other stuff. So that's the reasoning behind helper methods. And it also allows us to practice the single responsibility principle. That's something you should be thinking about as a developer just throughout your career, writing more efficient code. So this is totally reasonable if this feels a little bit weird. But really all we're doing is just calling a method. And this is something that you will sort of have to get comfortable doing. So you'll get more practice with it too. Sweet.
I have a quick question about methods. It doesn't run chronologically, right? You can reference a method that comes, like reference a method before the method is called.
Reference a method.
Like let's say you wanted to reference, not that like you would, but you wanted to reference shoe size within num player scored or num points scored.
Yes, I would say technically you should be able to. Like pry might disrupt it in a sense. If you try to, like if you have a pry and you're defining that method below, you're still not going to have access to it unless the pry is all the way at the end, because the code is literally stopped during runtime. However, any other time, it doesn't matter what the order of these methods are. What you want to imagine Ruby doing is it's loading up source code that's going to be available for your program to run. So even if I don't call any of these methods, as soon as I create this, I have source code available, and order's not going to matter at that point. once the file is done loading, you're gonna have access to all that information. This RSpec is what's referencing it. So that's the only way that it gets to the methods are getting called, which is why we can only hit the pry through RSpec fail fast. Sweet. All right, so we got some practice writing methods out. I know it's 4:32, so we're a little over. But just an introduction to getting comfortable writing methods, practicing enumerables, and getting comfortable reading RSpec tests. These are skill sets that you need to work on throughout the week. So the rest of the day is going to be focused on continuing through labs. I recommend revisiting the enumerables labs. Like some of you said, after we introduced like the more complex labs that forced you to do each, it's possible that enumerables or array enumerables isn't top of mind right now, which is totally fine. Take some time to review it. You'll get some more practice with it throughout the week. And I think we have an hour before stand downs, and I'll make this available throughout the week. As a quick heads up, we'll have stand downs at the end of the day, every day at 5:30. And it's a chance for us to kind of recoup, close out the day, answer any final questions that you have. And today's structure is a bit more relaxed. Tomorrow we'll kind of start going through like concepts that you still don't understand, what you worked on for the day, and we'll be treating it more similar to stand-ups that you'll be doing out in the industry. Cool. But for now, you'll be working on labs, and then we'll come back for stand-ons at 5:30. Any questions? All right, I'm gonna stop sharing, and I'm gonna